Hi, and welcome to Art History 5970 Seminar in British Art. I am Dr. Erin Duncan-O'Neill, and I'm an art historian specializing in 19th century European art here at OU. And I want to welcome you to this class. I'm very excited about this seminar. I'm excited to dig into this material with you. And during the period we will cover in this course, which roughly spans the mid-18th century through the mid-20th century, with a few outlier works, we will track British painting rising from something quite derivative and provincial to something really innovative and challenging, rivaling and competing with the fine arts of France and Germany. The golden age of painting coincided with economic success and relative political stability in Britain. And this was an age marked by pragmatism and materialism, and that means faith in the observable world, in rationality and observation and science. Tendencies which led Napoleon Bonaparte to dismiss the British as a nation of shopkeepers, a nation that was interested in the material, the commercial, the pragmatic. And while Britain's success is historically marked in this period as fundamentally commercial, the same spirit of inquiry and innovation was shared by great thinkers like Locke and Newton and Hume, really influential thinkers. I'm showing you one of my favorite paintings from this class, and this is William Hogarth's The Painter and His Pug. And I will say that for most of this class, you won't get videos like this, but instead I'm going to upload PowerPoints with audio embedded. So you'll get a description of the artwork and its exact title and date, so all that information will be much more findable. But I thought this first class you might want to sort of have a more interactive thing. So this is Hogarth's The Painter and His Pug from 1745. And here we see this spirit of inquiry and observation leading the artist here, placing himself, I'll move a little bit, and I'll get a pointer going on, placing his portrait, and you can see that in this painting he makes an illusionistic canvas which he places on top of a stack of books, literally placing himself on Shakespeare and Swift and Milton, so on top of the same sort of spirit of inquiry and innovation, traditions of experimentation and observation. And Hogarth, around the time he makes this portrait, produces a theoretical treatise called The Analysis of Beauty in 1753. And this treatise rejects the abstract images of beauty in favor of art that's derived from true observation of life and movement, something that Hogarth symbolizes with this serpentine line, which he places on this little painting palette here. The serpentine line, it's like, not idealized, but something derived from life. So this shows the artist in a portrait form next to his pug, his dog, which was actually called Trump, between whom there is clearly a kind of visual affinity. So the artist looks like his dog here, which is unflattering, right, for the artist himself. So again, he's showing such a dedication to real observation, to unidealization, that he makes his poor little pug with his little tongue hanging out quite ugly, and then the artist has this kind of shared affinity here. So this is the 18th century in Britain, and as we go back to the 18th century, we're going to think about this period as being the one where the first museums emerged in Europe. There were no truly public venues to view art in Britain, and really in Europe, but in London especially, until the 1760s. So the public spaces for viewing art before that were spaces like churches, right? Sometimes political buildings, public buildings, palaces, certain times, certain spaces were public. But we're going to think about the kind of institutions and contexts in which art was viewed at this moment, and the institutions that that trained artists also. So we're going to think about the conditions under which artists like Hogarth and others became painters during this period, but also, in the case of Hogarth's, a printmaker. He moves between painting and printmaking in order to find a broader audience, a more democratic audience in the 18th century here. And that, in part, is because England did not have formal schools of art or formal spaces for art viewing until, as I said, the 1760s. So if you wanted your art to reach an audience, Hogarth's strategy, at least, was you turn it into prints so people can easily afford it. So this course is going to investigate questions of context, institutional context, social context, political context, as well as questions of patronage and observation and portraiture throughout the semester. You can see, I hope, on your syllabus that we're going to proceed broadly in chronological sequence, focusing on individual artists as case studies for the major questions and pressures confronting British art from the 18th to the 20th centuries. For this class, you're going to need to purchase a small textbook by Wilton. It's fairly small and fairly cheap. I'll actually show you. Oh, will it capture this? A picture of this here, 5 Centuries of British Painting. You'll also need to purchase a copy of Oscar Wilde's novel, The Portrait of Dorian Gray. I give you an edition on the syllabus. I don't really care what edition you use, but you will have to read it for one of our meetings on British aestheticism later in the semester. The rest of your readings will be available as e-reserves on our Canvas page. And in this class, you will also have 2 exams and 2 papers, which I'll talk to you about in much more detail as we get closer to them. One paper will be a short analysis of a portrait, because this is a category of painting that is quite important in this class. And it's also, I'll just say as an aside, it's also a category of artwork that we tend to look at a lot as casual consumers of images in our moment. So as you're flipping through Instagram or other social media sites, you're often looking at portraits. You're often looking at people setting their own images up or taking images, taking photographs of other people, setting them up in various degrees of sophistication. So our need to read images of people, our need to read portraits has become, I think, increasingly urgent. So it's something we're going to study in this class. So that will be your first paper. And your second paper or project is going to be a virtual exhibition that you are going to select images for research and curate together as a group. So this is going to, usually we sort of take up space in the School of Art, but you're going to do this virtually as curators. Your exams will happen on Canvas. They'll be sort of take-home exams where you'll respond to a couple of prompts, an essay form, and I'll release that, say, 48 hours in advance, and you'll turn it in on Canvas also. But that shouldn't be too much of a challenge, because the other requirement for this class is that you complete twice weekly discussion posts. So as you look at your syllabus, you will see, and I'm sorry, Hogarth and Trump are up here with me while I'm talking about this, but you'll see twice weekly subjects for the week. So say Hogarth and Gainsborough, and on the date that that's due, you'll have a lecture to watch or listen to and a reading to do, and you'll have a discussion thread that asks you to think about the material that you've digested in the lecture and the reading and come up with an analysis or a response. You'll also have 2 replies due to your classmates due every Tuesday and Thursday along with those responses, and all of that will be due at 10 p.m. I'm pretty strict about these deadlines. You can earn up to 80% of your total grade for discussion responses if you turn them in late, and I'm sort of flexible about when you turn those in. So if you have a challenging week, you can kind of come back and earn a lot of points on these things, but I'm very strict. I'm not flexible at all about deadlines for paper assignments and, of course, exams. If you have anything emerges where you think something's going to be late, you should talk to me well in advance and get permission for deadline extensions. We're living in a global pandemic. That's why you're taking this class online. So I know that life is even more complicated now than it often is. So just talk to me if you need any flexibility or extra help, because I'm very happy to be a support for you during this time. So you have twice weekly discussion posts, you have 2 writing assignments and 2 take-home exams, and we're going to cover a lot of really fantastic material. Your attendance, because this class is online, will be built into those discussion responses. So make sure you keep up with those. That's a big part of your grade. That's 40% of your grade, these discussion responses. So if you keep up with those, the rest should fall in line pretty seamlessly. So we'll cover the material in this class briefly. I'll just give you a kind of preview of the topics that we're going to cover for the rest of our time here, just because I can't help myself, and I'd like to make sure that I have you're interested in this class before you really get going on it, and address a couple of other points of logistics and business at the end, and then also in an announcement. So if anything's unclear logistics-wise, reach out to me anytime. So we can learn a lot about the social and political world of the 18th century through artists like Hogarth. And Hogarth became famous for his series of paintings satirizing the social dynamics of his moment. And this is one of his marriage scenes, and we see the sort of his critical and disastrous thoughts about the institution of marriage, and also class and race, and bad taste in art is actually a big focus of this scene. And Hogarth is going to be an incisive critic of his own moment, and through that critiques we can learn a lot about the 18th century dynamics sort of swirling around him. He also, as I said, did engravings. He produced these large-scale history paintings, but sort of with the end goal of producing engravings that he could sell. This is how he made his money, and how he spread his messages. He increased the value of his paintings because they became popular in prints like this. But he also, got the message out because it was affordable. You could sort of pick up a print for a pretty cheap price. And they acted as a kind of entertainment. So he has all these details, and we'll go into all these details in our class on Hogarth, but this is just filled with syphilis pustules on faces, with sort of tattered nylons here, which give you a message about this prostitute that we're seeing here. Portraits of Roman rulers, which have there's a lot of references to Rome at the end of the 18th century because there were fears that civilization was collapsing just as Rome had collapsed. And so you have Roman portraits, and then you actually have it's hard to see in this black and white print, but you actually have a map on fire. So there's a sense that the world is ending in this tavern scene. So he's making this print for the lower classes to buy. And he's making fun of everybody. He's making fun of the young aristocratic man. This is the rake, a phrase which has now been popularized by Bridgerton. So people actually know what a rake is when I say it. So you have this sort of wealthy aristocratic dude that the lower classes are very happy to make fun of. The lower classes, prostitutes, are also mocked mercilessly by Hogarth, and he's creating this robust art market where everybody wants to buy this stuff, and he's embedding this very sort of serious moral message about his concerns about the end of the world, and decadence and desire and syphilis. So his sort of real and serious social issues embedded here. So the foibles of this one man are standing in for the decadence and decline of society as a whole. So this is another reason we study Hogarth and also the other artists in this class is artists tend to be they have good eyes, right? They're paying attention, they're representing the world, and in those representations we can learn a lot about that world that they're representing and the values, both artistic, political, behind it. So to combat the social and artistic chaos that Hogarth is tracing here in this tavern scene in his art, and he also helped to flame, we'll also look at the efforts of another artist, Sir Joshua Reynolds. And this looks very tame compared to our friend Hogarth here. This is a portrait that required multiple sittings with the artist. It's quite formal. Clients would come to Reynolds to commission their portraits. He was the most critically successful painter of his time, the official painter to King George III. He was the first president of the Royal Academy of Painting and Sculpture, the big arts institution, the arts school, and that was an institution that attempted to standardize artistic training and the juried exhibitions of art. So if Hogarth was sort of making his own way, Reynolds wanted to make an institution to create rules and structure and training for artists. And we're looking here at a full-length portrait. The canvas is about 8 or 9 feet tall. And you can see that the woman is in a classicized dress. And there was actually an English taste for fashion that was inspired by the ancient world at this moment. And France would have the same fashion about 20 years later. Here we see Lady Archer fanning, using a little urn. There's a fire here. She was sacrificing to the Graces. You would understand this if you knew some of this sort of archaic imagery here. So in other words, making a sacrifice to emblems of female virtue here. So this painting is saying that the sitter, a contemporary sitter, embodies female virtue. Reynolds puts her in this grand and ancient setting to ennoble her. And unlike Hogarth, whose art is very British. It's sort of nationalistic. It's very serious about its Britishness. That pug is a very English dog. Reynolds has sort of European continental references here. He spent time in Italy, and he is interested in idealizing his sitters. So while Hogarth was happy to show you that he looks quite puggish in his own appearance, Reynolds wants to idealize a person and not worry so much about lived observation. He wanted to idealize, he wanted to elevate English painting. Again, drawing from ideas from the ancient world, from the continent. And when we discuss Reynolds later, we're going to explore how paintings like this were seen at the time and what it meant to exhibit them, these 9-foot paintings of specific contemporary people in public venues. Portraiture took on a renewed authority, as we will see, at the hands of not only Reynolds, but Thomas Gainsborough. Gainsborough was Reynolds' #1 rival for elite London clientele for portraits. And we'll compare these two artists, but Gainsborough has much looser brushstrokes. He sort of resists the control of Reynolds' teaching. And so we see some portions of the sitter, this woman's hair, for instance, the sort of bottom of her dress, unresolved, sort of blending a little bit more into the landscape. The landscape behind her is not as well ordered. And nature in the 1780s, when this painting was made, was conceived to be wilder. You think of the writings of Rousseau, who said at this moment in the 1780s that man is not a wholly reasonable or rational being. A kind of thinking that was reinforced by American thinkers and French thinkers who were beginning to see man not as this sort of continuation of ancient rationality and thought and values, but something a bit wilder, not wholly subject to control or order here. So we see some of these deeper values embedded in the artworks that we're going to see. Here with the landscape, a kind of creeping irrationality. And this thought about irrationality is echoed by the artist William Blake. Blake experimented with materials and subject matter, and in his artwork, as you can begin to see here, started to depart from the seen world and rational thought, and instead began to explore visionary experience. So not just sort of imaginative artworks, but spiritual, visionary sort of experiences or quests. He and later aestheticists, another movement that we're going to explore in this class, like William Morris, whose design you see behind me, incorporated designs from industry. Morris did, which was exploding at this moment. So Morris weaves in pattern and text in designs, aligning art with craft and industrial design. So we have, which was a very politically motivated move for Morris at this moment, a politically charged decision to try to elevate craft to the level of fine arts, especially at moments when labor was being reorganized and geared towards mass production. So we're going to see sort of the reconceptualization of religion and spiritual experience and the reconceptualization of labor with some of the artists in this class. This is another one of my favorite artworks that you'll see this semester, and it seems like maybe not much at all to you as you're looking at it now. This is John Constable's The Haywain from 1824, and this is to introduce to you today the idea that landscape painting does not just reflect nature, right? It doesn't just show you what the English countryside might look like, but also the political circumstances that shaped that land and new sciences surrounding vision and weather and agriculture. We can see all of this embedded in landscape painting. Constable is going to become extremely influential to French artists. You can think about the Impressionists in the decades after him. He was awarded a medal at a French salon. And again, he's going to tell us about how land and labor and nature were conceived politically at the moment when these paintings were produced. And the landscape is often a reflection of how a nation sees itself or is trying to see itself. And so landscape is going to be a very interesting category. Here is J.W. Turner's Rain, Steam, and Speed. I think I'm getting that title right. And here we see a train, quite a new technology at this moment in the early 1800s, cutting across a landscape at this kind of high speed. And here Turner is using the steam from a form of modern mass transportation, a train, and fog to explore the new formal possibilities of indistinct paint, confusing subject matter, sort of dancing up to the point of abstraction. So Turner is bringing the landscape tradition, this long tradition, to near abstraction, working really alone in this very modern method decades before abstraction became an established art historical concept. So landscapes may seem at the outset like a very dull genre, but I'm here to prove that they have a lot to say about how societies and economies are organized. Landscape can be propagandistic, political, aspirational, deeply subversive, just like any other genre. And this is a painting that sort of blends portraiture and landscape together. This is Thomas Gainsborough, who we saw just a second ago. Gainsborough's Mr. and Mrs. Andrews from 1848 to 1850. And here we have a young squire, a young gentleman, which means somebody who owns land, and his wife, newly married. This might have been a wedding portrait. And he's holding a hunting rifle. She's set on this sort of iron bench. And beyond them and to the right stretches their fertile farmland, again, which gives him the title, which makes him a gentleman. And there's an emphasis here. How was the land organized? And why put so much land? Why is land sort of defining this couple here? There's a lot of emphasis on these neatly gathered sheaves of wheat in the bottom right-hand corner of this painting. And this shows sort of how organized Mr. Andrews is at managing his land, how well managed this land is. We also get, in addition to these detailed sheaves of wheat, we can see that this is a massive amount of land that he owns. So it shows the magnitude of their land, the proprietary claim that grants them their gentrified status. So property is important here, right? Ownership is important, and that extends even to the wife. My head is in the way, but there's a little unfinished passage which might be a pheasant. This painting, that's bare canvas here, probably a dead pheasant shot by her husband, symbolizing that she too has been ensnared, right, by the chase, the romantic chase that led to their union. The land, we have these fenced off areas, you can see in the difference, and this demonstrates that Andrews exploited advanced agricultural techniques like crop rotation. So he's this modern, a modern landowner exploiting modern techniques. So we're going to dive a little bit more into this painting when we talk about Gainsborough, but we're going to show, right, how portraits are set up and what messaging, what sort of intense messaging they're set to do, what the kind of work that landscaping is doing, in painting. But we're also going to think about, as we look at artworks from this class, what isn't being shown in some of these paintings? Well, what's not being shown is the people who are actually working the land, right? The laborers in the, Mr. Andrews in these sort of silky stockings is not gathering this weed up here. And so Gainsborough, and he's not alone in doing this, sort of ignores, but also signals some of the very serious political issues that were happening in this period. This was a moment of very intense and reorganization of work and land in the 18th century, where the size of people's properties was expanding and pushing out smaller landowners. So showing the sort of peasant population or the agricultural workers would have sort of opened up this painting to bigger issues that were happening at the time. So the real picture of the countryside or the moment was not always expressed directly in art. We have to think about who pays for these canvases, the wealthy patrons who wanted images of order and stability, which would legitimize their spheres of control. And so we're going to contextualize art in that way. Now, as economies shifted to cities and urban industries, change necessarily inspired concern and nostalgia from artists. So as those farms like the Andrewses sort of expanded and pushed out smaller farmers, those sort of peasants, really, they had been this lower class of worker often had to move to the cities and become factory workers. So this is a big sort of demographic change we're going to talk a little bit about in this class, and that we see in a painting by Ford Madox Brown called Work. This attempts to capture that very labor missing in the Gainsborough portrait. And so we see urban laborers, we see street urchins, sort of orphans, we see resting trench diggers, we see the middle-class men supervising them, we see flower sellers, so we see all kinds of classes in society. But Madox Brown, who's quite sympathetic to the working classes, kind of still can't let go of the hierarchies organizing society. And so we're going to look at this painting and sort of tease out all of the different hierarchies and values happening in this massive painting. Madox Brown is part of a group called the Pre-Raphaelite movement. If you haven't heard of it, that's pretty common, but I'm going to show you it's a very strange and political and important movement, actually presaging Impressionism in the French context. We're also going to look at the British aestheticists. This is Edward Burne-Jones, and here you see a move towards nostalgia, right? A kind of medieval turn. Nostalgia and escapism and this sort of sleepy sensuality in aestheticism. The aestheticists also established kind of guild-like networks of artists expressing this desire to return to a time before industrialization and before the Royal Academy and before Raphael. That's where the pre-Raphaelite comes from, right? They wanted to go back to the medieval period, medieval art, medieval society. And so we're going to see the pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood, and which kind of transitioned into this movement called aestheticism. And so we're going to trace these major movements, these big ambitions and reactions to prosperity and inequities and change through art in the British context. We're going to see the ways in which visual art practice, mainly painting in this class, but also sculpture and fabric design and print, responds to social and political and economic contexts. And Here I'll just tease a 20th century work, Rachel Whiteread's House from 1993. So this is, work from the 1990s, but a much more contemporary work. This is actually made out of concrete, and it's this really haunting protest to economic and demographic change in the late 20th century. So responding to some of the same issues that were happening in the 19th century, but art sort of making its critique in this new way. So this class, we're going to be looking at institutional, political, social contexts in British art making from around 1750 to the late 20th century. We'll also see some colonialist art through a social justice perspective. So what did it mean to be colonized by the British? What did it mean to be Black, seen by the British? And we're going to get a fuller context for the influence of British art in the American practice. You can imagine how much early American artists were really looking to Britain, but also in contemporary work today. You know, London is still this major center for contemporary art practice today. So understanding British art will help you, I hope, understand art history more broadly. So welcome to the class. I will wrap up with any more logistical concerns, the sort of syllabus stuff, and the announcement that this video is attached to. And please email me at any moment. I'm really available to you this semester with questions about content, about assignments, about grades, about how to use Canvas. I'm here to help. Thanks, guys.